Frank Dawson stared at the microwave clock in the dark, early hours of a Tuesday morning, the blue digits blinking 4:17 a.m. like some quiet reminder that time, unlike him, never slept. The coffee pot burbled behind him, the only sound in the still kitchen, and he leaned heavily on the worn laminate counter, his knuckles white and calloused from years long past, years when his hands still built things that mattered. His house was too quiet these days. Ellie had been gone almost a decade, but sometimes he still reached for her in the night, only to find cold sheets and memory. He hadn't seen his daughter, Lynn, since Christmas, and even then it was mostly silence and polite nods. Frank used to wire buildings, run teams, fix things when they broke. Now, at 72, the only thing he seemed to fix was toast every morning. He shuffled to the recliner, clicked on the TV with its stubborn remote, and settled into his usual routine. Old war documentaries, reruns of MAS*H, maybe a local news broadcast if he could stomach it. But this morning, something was different. A bold headline slid across the screen, one of those ticker tapes you normally ignored, except this one stopped him cold. Elon Musk unveils Tesla's new solid-state battery, promises to power America for the next 50 years. Frank squinted at the screen. 50 years, he mumbled, as if saying it out loud might make it real. The segment cut to a clip, Elon on stage, wearing a black t-shirt, confident, almost defiant, as he explained how the new battery would revolutionize energy storage, decentralize power, and potentially take entire regions off fossil fuels. The words were fast and technical, but the message was simple: we don't have to be stuck anymore. Something about the way he said it, that unshakable belief, that urgency, cut through Frank like a wire to live current. He hadn't felt that kind of jolt in years. What if everything he believed about getting old was wrong? What if slowing down wasn't biology, it was conditioning? He chuckled at himself, a dry, half-hearted thing. Get a grip, Frank. You're not gonna change the world. Hell, you barely changed your underwear yesterday. Still, he couldn't stop thinking about it. Something in that clip had pressed on an old, dusty part of him, the part that once dreamed of building a solar-powered RV after retirement. He and Ellie used to joke about it. Travel the country. Live off the sun. Our own little grid, she'd said once, tracing his hand on a napkin while they sat in a diner in Kansas City. He'd started sketching designs in a notebook after that. He even had a name picked out, the Dawson Current. It sounded silly now. A young man's dream. But dreams didn't die, they just got buried under piles of junk mail and doctor's appointments. Frank leaned forward, reaching slowly toward the remote. Instead of changing the channel, he clicked over to YouTube. His fingers moved awkwardly, like they'd forgotten how to type. He typed in, Tesla battery breakthrough. The page loaded with videos, analysts, engineers, podcasters all marveling at the tech. But it wasn't the specs he cared about, it was the spark. Elon said, when the rules don't make sense anymore, you make new ones. Frank paused the video. Rewound it. Played it again. The words lingered. Something inside him stirred, equal parts memory, grief, and the faintest flicker of hope. He rubbed his palms together, a nervous habit he hadn't done since Ellie died. The sun was starting to rise now, a pale orange light cutting through the kitchen blinds, making everything look sharper, more alive. He hadn't been out in days, maybe weeks, except for groceries or appointments. He lived in a house full of silence, haunted not by ghosts, but by the absence of the life he once had. People looked at him like he was already halfway gone, his doctor, his neighbors, even Lynn sometimes. They didn't say it, but he saw it in their eyes, poor Frank. Hanging on. But maybe, just maybe, he didn't want to hang on anymore. Maybe he wanted to grab on. He remembered the old notebook. It had to be in the garage somewhere, buried under toolboxes and boxes of tax records and junk. His hands trembled a little as he stood. The house creaked as he walked, not because it was old, but because he was. In the garage, he coughed at the dust. The sunlight cut through the small window, making golden shapes in the haze. He moved some boxes, shoved aside an old cooler, and there it was, a brown leather notebook with his initials faintly embossed on the cover. FD inside were diagrams, wiring plans, material lists. Notes written in a younger version of his own handwriting. Battery bank here. Solar panel array mounted on roof. Weight balance test needed. Ask Ellie about color scheme. The words made his eyes sting. He could almost hear her voice again, see her leaning over the notebook, teasing him about painting the RV green. He flipped to the last page. A half-finished sketch. It was rough, but it had promise. His dream had sat in this garage for nearly 30 years. Forgotten. Dismissed. Laughed at, even by himself. But now. Maybe the world had finally caught up to the crazy old man with the RV idea. He ran a hand over the page like it was a relic. He went back inside, sat at the kitchen table, and opened his laptop. He Googled Tesla home battery retrofit. Then, off-grid RV builds for seniors. Then, solar retirement projects. Forums popped up. Videos. One guy in Arizona had built a solar-powered van at 68. Another woman in Maine retrofitted her trailer. There were people doing this. Living lighter. Living louder. The sun was higher now, filling the kitchen with light. For the first time in years, Frank didn't feel like a relic. He felt like a pilot. He started scribbling notes on a yellow legal pad. He made a list: check RV listings. Call local scrapyard. Price solar kits. He circled a phrase: test battery integration. He smiled. That morning, the world had told him he was finished. That his only purpose now was to stay quiet, take his pills, and wait. But a headline, a voice, a moment had reminded him, his time wasn't up. It had just been paused. There was still voltage in him. And he was ready to connect again. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Before the house got quiet, before Ellie's voice became a memory he replayed like a favorite old record, and before his knees started clicking with every step, Frank Dawson had a life so full of noise, motion, and purpose that even the thought of stillness used to irritate him. Back then, he was the kind of man who woke up before the sun not because he had to but because he liked to be ahead. His work boots were always by the door, dust-covered and reliable, like the man who wore them. As a master electrician, Frank wired schools, factories, firehouses, hell, he even lit up the scoreboard at the high school football field. He could walk into a breaker room and understand it like a mechanic understands an engine. He wasn't flashy, never chased titles or gave much thought to retirement plans. He just worked, built, provided, and kept the lights on for everybody else. Ellie used to tease him about it: you spend your life lighting up everyone's world but your own. He'd just grin and kiss her cheek. She was his soft place to land, his better half in every sense. They'd met in 1976 at a 4th of July picnic, both invited by mutual friends who claimed they were too good to be single. Ellie had long auburn hair, a bookish calm about her, and a smile that made Frank feel like she could see past all his walls. They married a year later, bought the little 2-bedroom house on Hickory Street, and raised their daughter Lynn there, who was born in 1980 with a shock of black hair and lungs that could wake the whole neighborhood. Frank built her a treehouse when she was 7, ran a wire through the maple tree so she could plug in a radio. She called it her sky office. Those were the golden years. Sunday barbecues, trips to the lake, long nights on the porch with Ellie under a string of lights he wired up himself. Life had shape, color, rhythm. Frank worked, Ellie taught elementary school, and together they made a simple, solid life. He didn't have time for dreams then. Dreams were for people who hadn't yet bought a water heater or worried about property taxes. But still, They crept in around the edges, especially in the evenings when Ellie would bring out her iced tea and he'd show her his napkin sketches of the Dawson Current, that solar-powered RV he swore they'd take across the country one day. "We'll stop in every weird roadside attraction," she'd say. "And you'll fix things for people along the way." He loved that she believed in it, even if he didn't, not really. He kept the idea in a notebook, promised, someday, and then tucked it behind oil change receipts and tax files. When Ellie got sick in 2013, everything tilted. It started with fatigue, then the cough, then tests, then answers, lung cancer, stage 3. Frank drove her to every treatment, sat in every waiting room, and held her hand through every bad scan. She never complained. Not once. He watched the light dim in her eyes day by day, until finally, in October 2015, she was gone. The house got quiet that day. Not just quieter, hollow. Lynn came and stayed for a while, but she had her own life, her own kids. After Ellie's funeral, Frank found himself sitting at the kitchen table at midnight with no one to talk to. The silence felt like cement. He tried to stay busy. He helped neighbors with odd jobs. Repainted the bathroom. Volunteered once or twice at the local community center. But nothing filled the space Ellie had left behind. And then slowly, without really noticing, Frank stopped. Stopped fixing things. Stopped visiting friends. Stopped answering the phone. He became a shadow of the man he'd been, a figure who wandered between his recliner, the fridge, and the front porch, like a ghost that forgot why it haunted the place. He didn't know when he stopped caring about the notebook. He knew where it was, sure, but it had become like a photo album of a life that didn't belong to him anymore. Lynn would call once a week, mostly out of duty. Her voice always felt like it was reaching him from a different planet. She'd ask if he was eating okay, if he was taking his meds, if he was thinking about moving to an assisted living complex. "Dad, you don't need to be alone in that big house," she'd say. "It's not healthy." He'd grunt, change the subject. He didn't know how to tell her that he stayed because it was the last place Ellie had ever laughed. When he did go out, it was to the diner or the hardware store. People knew him there, but they didn't really see him. They'd nod, offer a "Hey Frank," then go back to their lives. He'd sit at the counter, order black coffee and eggs over easy, and listen to the buzz of conversations he wasn't part of. Sometimes, when he looked in the mirror, he didn't recognize the man staring back. The eyes were the same, maybe, but the posture was slouched, the skin looser, the fire gone. He felt like the world had moved on without him, like he was some leftover relic from a time nobody cared about anymore. The worst part wasn't the loneliness, it was the irrelevance. The slow erasure of meaning. Once, he'd mattered. People needed him. Now, it was like he'd aged out of usefulness. The day he heard that headline about Elon Musk and the Tesla battery, he wasn't looking for a reason to change. He was just passing time, like always. But that spark, however faint, was real. And the more he thought about it, the more it itched at something buried deep inside him. If the world was really on the verge of a new energy revolution, if power could now be stored in a way that made things mobile, self-sustaining, clean, then maybe that dream he once had wasn't so foolish. Maybe the old RV sketch wasn't some old man's fantasy. Maybe it was just, early. He remembered something Ellie had said in 1989, after a big storm knocked out power for 3 days. They'd lit candles, cooked over a camp stove, and slept in the living room. "Imagine if we had our own power," she said, wrapped in a quilt. Not just the lights, but real freedom. That line stuck with him for 36 years. Real freedom. The kind you build yourself. He thought about that more and more after that morning with the news segment. He tried to dismiss it, tried to go back to routine, but the notebook called to him like a voice in the dark. When he found it in the garage, the memories came flooding back, the ink-stained fingertips, the soldering burns, the diagrams sketched during halftime shows and family road trips. It felt like opening a time capsule, except the man who had buried it was still alive. That afternoon, he sat with the notebook for hours, barely noticing the sun fading behind the trees outside. He didn't move, didn't eat, didn't even turn on the TV. He was in it. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man waiting to be forgotten. He felt like a man remembering. At some point, long after dark, he looked down at the last page and realized he'd picked up a pen. He had started a new diagram, almost without knowing it. A newer version. Using a solid-state battery, lighter solar panels, more efficient inverters. The technology had changed. But he hadn't. Not really. That night, lying in bed, he didn't reach for Ellie in the dark. He just lay there, staring at the ceiling, his mind running wild with measurements, voltage requirements, and trailer weights. He was 72 years old. His back hurt every morning. He took 2 blood pressure pills and had arthritis in both hands. But that night, something shifted. The dream hadn't died. It had just been waiting for the right time. And maybe that time, just maybe, was now. Frank Dawson always thought aging would be gradual, a quiet slide down a gentle hill. Instead, it felt more like being pushed off a cliff in slow motion, each year another step backward, another inch of distance between who he was and who people believed he could still be. The doctor's office was cold and sterile, as usual, all gray walls and the faint smell of antiseptic and latex gloves. He sat on the crinkled paper of the exam table, his shirt off, watching the ceiling tiles and counting how many of them had small brown stains in the corners. Dr. Abrams came in, clipboard in hand, eyes darting quickly between numbers and scan results before settling into that familiar expression that all older folks learn to dread, a mixture of clinical concern and subtle condescension. "Your blood pressure's steady, cholesterol's manageable," the doctor began, as if reading off a grocery list. "But at your age, Frank, I'd recommend slowing down. Maybe ease off the physical labor. Your knees are showing more wear, and your left shoulder's losing range." Frank grunted. "You saying I shouldn't carry a wrench anymore?" Dr. Abrams smiled the way doctors do when they're trying to soften the blow. "I'm saying there's no need to push yourself. You've earned your rest." That word, rest, sat sour in Frank's gut. He nodded through the rest of the appointment, half listening as the doctor recommended stretching exercises, a lighter diet, and engaging hobbies like birdwatching or light gardening. When he walked out to his truck, the September air crisp against his skin, he didn't feel old, he felt dismissed. Like a machine someone had decided to unplug before it stopped running. He gripped the steering wheel tighter than he needed to, drove without the radio on, and went straight to the hardware store because he needed to feel useful again, even if just by buying something he didn't need. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the familiar scent of sawdust and motor oil wrapped around him like an old jacket. He wandered the aisles, picking up a voltage tester, then a roll of insulated wire, running his thumb along the rubber coating like it might remind him who he used to be. As he moved toward the register, a teenager stocking shelves glanced at his basket and smirked. "Building a spaceship, old man," the kid said, laughing. Frank froze. He hadn't even looked threatening, just some hunched guy in flannel and worn jeans. He gave a forced half-smile and walked past, his ears burning. He could hear the kid snickering behind him. The woman at the register scanned his items and said nothing. He paid in cash. He left without looking back. When he got home, he stood in the garage for 10 minutes without moving, just staring at the notebook on his workbench. The designs looked sound. They looked better than sound, they looked possible. But what did it matter? If the world thought he was too old, and the doctors agreed, and the teenagers laughed, then what was the point? He sat down heavily in the old metal stool and stared at the concrete floor, wishing Ellie were there. She would have said something simple but piercing, like, "Do it anyway." That's what she always used to say when life told them no. Do it anyway. He reached for his phone and opened the Reddit app. He'd only installed it a week ago after watching YouTube videos about DIY solar setups. His account was barely used, but tonight, hands shaking, he posted something in a community called r/solar DIY. I'm a 72-year-old retired electrician. Thinking of retrofitting an old RV with solar panels and possibly one of those new Tesla batteries. Just wondering if I'm insane, or if this has been done before. He hit post and walked away from the phone like it might explode. The next morning, he had nearly 200 replies. Some were jokes, sure, but most were real. Encouraging. Helpful. A guy in Oregon linked to his own build. A woman in Colorado sent blueprints she'd drawn for a solar-powered tiny home. Another user simply wrote, "You're never too old to build something that matters." Frank read the comments slowly, over coffee, like scripture. That sentence, the one about still mattering, hit him like a hammer to the chest. Maybe he wasn't crazy. Maybe he wasn't obsolete. Maybe all the noise telling him to slow down was just the echo of a world that didn't know what to do with people like him, people who still had fire left in them. That night, lying in bed, he played the Elon Musk clip again. The one from the battery launch, the one where Elon said, "We're not here to maintain the status quo. We're here to break the system that says only the young get to shape the future." Frank watched it 4 times. Then he searched for more. Podcasts, interviews, snippets of Elon speaking about failing, about risk, about pushing past limits. He didn't idolize the man. He wasn't blind to the controversy, the eccentricity, but something about Elon's refusal to accept boundaries lit something in Frank. It wasn't about batteries. It wasn't about cars. It was about rejecting the narrative. The next day, he pulled the RV specs off a forum and started mapping them against his old drawings. The original design could work with a few modern tweaks. He needed lighter panels, a lithium-ion inverter, and a storage setup that could handle long gaps between charge cycles. The Tesla battery could make it all possible, if he could get one. He also needed an RV. He opened Craigslist and searched within 100 miles. The results were mostly junk, rotted floorboards, rusted exteriors, overpriced wrecks, but he didn't care. He made a list, grabbed his jacket, and drove. At every stop, sellers looked at him like a tourist, like someone asking too many questions for someone who'd never really buy. But he kicked the tires, crawled under frames, tested outlets. At the 4th house, he found it, a 1984 Winnebago, paint peeling, engine dead, but structurally sound. It was sitting on a gravel lot behind an old barn, sun-bleached and unloved. The man selling it was maybe 40, impatient. "You fixing it up for a grandkid's treehouse or something?" he asked. Frank didn't answer. He just nodded, circled the RV again, and said, "I'll take it." He handed over $1,000 in cash, hitched it to his truck, and drove it back through town while people on sidewalks turned to stare. The neighbors watched from their porches as he backed it into the driveway, crooked but proud. One of them called out, "Hey Frank, you buying a time machine?" He just waved. That night, he stood in the garage with the RV looming outside and wrote across the first page of his notebook in thick black Sharpie, "Project Dawson Current, Phase 1. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong, not the doctor, not the kid in the store, not even Lynn. It was about proving something to himself. That he wasn't done. That he still had the power to create. To move. To matter. He hadn't told his daughter yet. He knew what she'd say. She'd worry, she'd scold, she'd suggest maybe focusing on safer hobbies. She meant well, always had. But she didn't understand. She hadn't lost what he lost. She hadn't stood in a kitchen where silence buzzed louder than the fridge. She hadn't opened a notebook that held 30 years of dust and dared to blow it clean. He didn't blame her. He just didn't plan to wait for her permission. That week, he ordered his first solar panel kit from a supplier in Nevada. He researched mounting brackets, charge controllers, and insulation upgrades. The garage became a war zone of cardboard, tools, and wires. His knees hurt. His hands ached. But when he looked at the chaos, he didn't see mess, he saw forward motion. One night, well past midnight, he wired a single LED light into the RV's ceiling panel. When it blinked on, humming low and blue in the dark, he smiled like a man who just lit a fuse on something far bigger than electricity. The first real change wasn't the RV parked in Frank Dawson's driveway, or the cluttered garage that now resembled a mad scientist's lab, or even the notebook that had gone from a dusty relic to a living, breathing blueprint. It was the walk. It started with 10 minutes down the street and back, the kind of thing he used to scoff at when Ellie called it exercise. But now, every morning, before coffee, before checking his parts list or scouring YouTube for installation tutorials, he laced up his sneakers, pulled on a jacket, and walked. Not for health. Not for a goal. Just to move. Just to feel like a man reclaiming motion. The neighborhood was still the same, the tidy lawns, the cracked sidewalks, the same houses with different colors, but something in Frank had shifted. He started noticing the sky more, the way the light hit the oak trees in Mrs. Wilkins' yard, the smell of someone baking early down the block. He didn't wave to everyone yet. But he nodded. That was enough. It was day 4 of the RV build when he decided to rip out the original wiring. It was brittle, discolored, a maze of outdated fuses and patched connections. Any other time, he would have hesitated, worried about ruining something he couldn't put back. But this wasn't any other time. This was now. He pulled it all, every wire, every fixture, every switch, until the RV's interior looked like the shell of a spaceship. A clean slate. He stood there, breathing in the musty smell of old carpet and wood paneling, holding a bundle of corroded wire in his hand like a trophy. It felt good. Powerful. Like taking back the wheel after drifting too long in neutral. That night, he posted a progress photo to the same forum. Day 4, stripped out all wiring. Building new circuit plan tomorrow. Open to any feedback. Within 2 hours, someone responded with a schematic. Another user offered to 3D print a custom fuse box. One guy said, "Can't wait to see this thing run. You're making us proud, old man." Frank chuckled. Not at the "old man" part, but at the way it was said, with admiration, not mockery. That was new. By day 6, he was learning terms he hadn't used in decades. MPPT charge controllers, battery management systems, heat shrink tubing for thermal safety. He even made a list of YouTube creators who explained things clearly. There was a young engineer in Texas who ended every video with, "Keep building, no matter what." Frank liked that. He watched her clips late at night when his hands hurt too much to keep working. It made him feel like he wasn't doing this alone. And that was maybe the most surprising part, he wasn't alone. People were watching. Strangers. A guy from Michigan messaged him asking for help on his van build. A retired school bus driver from Arizona shared photos of her converted Scully. Someone in the comments said, "You're what I want to be when I'm 72. Frank didn't know what to do with that, so he just kept building. The solar panels arrived on day 8, 4 of them, sleek and shining, each one more powerful than anything he could have dreamed of when he first drew the design in 1989. He laid them out in the driveway like precious art, inspecting for cracks, imagining how they'd look mounted to the RV's roof. He measured the space 3 times, chalked his markings, and double-checked wind resistance angles. His neighbors peeked out from behind curtains. One finally came over, Doug, from 2 doors down. "What's all this?" Doug asked, eyeing the panels like alien tech. "Power," Frank replied simply. Doug grinned. "You finally going off the grid?" Frank nodded. "That's the plan." Doug shook his head, whistling. "Damn. I didn't think anyone our age was still trying to do all that." Frank looked at him. Trying's half the point. That conversation stuck with him. People didn't expect much from someone his age. They expected routines. Decline. Quiet hobbies and slower days. But what they didn't expect, what made them stop and stare, was motion. A man choosing forward over still. That was the change. It wasn't the battery yet. It wasn't even the RV. It was the refusal to disappear. On day 10, he finally reached out to Lynn. He hadn't planned to. He told himself he'd wait until the project was further along. But something about seeing the panels on the roof made it feel real, and he didn't want her to find out secondhand. So he called. She answered on the third ring, her voice tired. "Hey, Dad. Everything okay?" "Yeah. More than okay," Frank said. "I bought an RV." A pause. "What?" "Retro 1. Winnebago. I'm converting it to solar. Using one of those new Tesla batteries. Remember the notebook your mom and I used to talk about?" Silence again. Then, "Dad, are you serious?" "As a heart attack. Which I haven't had, so don't worry." Lynn laughed. But it wasn't joy, it was confusion. Where is this coming from? He thought for a moment. I saw something about the new battery. Elon Musk. Made me think it wasn't too late. Too late for what? She asked. Too late for doing something that matters, he said. She was quiet again. Then, are you okay? Like, mentally? That one stung a little. I'm fine. Better than I've been in years. You're 72, Dad. This sounds like a lot. It is a lot. That's why it matters. She sighed. Just, be careful, okay? Please. Always am, he said. But they both knew that wasn't true. That call didn't go how he wanted. But it was honest. And that was a start. He didn't expect her to get it yet. The important part was that he did. On day 11, he held the new Tesla battery in his hands, a compact unit the size of a carry-on suitcase, dense and gleaming with potential. It had cost him a good chunk of his savings, and shipping had been a nightmare, but it was here. He unboxed it like a treasure, reading every instruction, watching every tutorial twice, even calling a helpline to double-check compatibility with his inverter setup. Installing it was delicate work. He measured the heat clearance, mounted the bracket, tested the ground. It took him 2 days. When he flipped the switch and the battery hummed to life, silently storing sunlight into motion, Frank sat down in the RV doorway and just stared at the sky. Not out of disbelief, but because he finally believed. It worked. The thing he thought he'd never do again, build something that mattered, was happening. Slowly. Roughly. But it was happening. That night, he posted another update. This time, the photo showed the RV glowing faintly from the inside, one overhead light shining from solar power alone. The caption was simple, Day 13. First light. The comments exploded. Yes. Legend. This is the most inspiring thing I've seen all week. And one that just said. You just lit something in me, too. Frank read that one again and again. Because that's what this was really about. Not energy. Not batteries. Not RVs or Elon Musk or proving the doctors wrong. It was about power. Real power. The kind that comes when you refuse to fade. The kind that reignites others. He knew he was far from finished. The plumbing was still shot. The flooring was warped. He hadn't even tested the engine yet. But he had the light. And that was the one thing he changed. He stopped waiting for permission, and started building anyway. It happened on a Tuesday, not that days really mattered anymore, not when the rhythm of your life stopped matching the clock on the wall and started syncing with something deeper, something internal. Frank had been working all morning on sealing the roof. The forecast called for rain later in the week, and he wasn't about to let moisture get into the battery housing. He'd crawled up the ladder at 8:15 a.m. Sharp, a roll of butyl tape in one hand and a caulking gun in the other, his knees already barking in protest. Every movement hurt, but it was a good kind of hurt, the kind that meant he was still in the game. Up on the roof, the world looked different. Not just the view, the rust-colored leaves beginning to fall from the maples, the distant hum of the interstate, the neighbor's kid riding his bike in wide figure-eights across the cul-de-sac, but the feeling of being above it all, even just 10 feet off the ground. He imagined Ellie beside him, smiling at how ridiculous he looked in his work goggles and patched jeans. She used to say he looked like a scruffy inventor when he got into one of his project modes. He liked that. That day, he wasn't just sealing a roof. He was protecting a dream. He was building something that was his, not because it would make money or turn heads, but because it came from a place that had gone quiet for too long and was now screaming to be heard. The break came at 11:43 a.m. He'd just finished resecuring the final panel when his phone buzzed inside his shirt pocket. Normally, he ignored calls while working, but something told him to check. It was a number he didn't recognize, and the area code was out of state, California. He answered anyway. "Hello. Is this Frank Dawson?" The voice was professional, polite, but warm. "Yes," Frank said, lowering himself carefully down the ladder with one hand still gripping the phone. "Who's this?" "My name's Rachel Kwan. I'm a producer with Future Vision. We run a YouTube channel about sustainable living and next-gen energy innovations. One of our moderators sent us a link to your Reddit post and your build photos. Are you really powering a 1984 Winnebago with a Tesla battery?" Frank hesitated, one boot hitting the grass with a soft thud. "Well, not yet. But I'm getting close." Rachel laughed. "That's incredible. We'd love to feature your project in an upcoming episode. Would you be open to that?" Frank blinked, heart suddenly thudding harder than it had since Ellie's funeral. "You serious?" "Dead serious. People need to see this kind of story, real folks, doing real work, proving that change isn't just for tech giants or 20-somethings. You're exactly the kind of person who inspires others to try." Frank didn't answer right away. He looked at the RV, with its patched windows and uneven primer, and then at his grease-stained hands. "I'm not doing this to go viral," he said. "I know," Rachel replied. "That's why it matters." They agreed on a Zoom call the next day. Rachel wanted to see the RV, hear the backstory, maybe include a montage if Frank had any old photos. After they hung up, he sat on the porch swing, phone in hand, and tried to wrap his head around what had just happened. Someone out there, a stranger, thought what he was doing was worth sharing. Worth seeing. Worth celebrating. That night, he pulled down the old box of photo albums. There were pictures from the 80s, Ellie in the garden, Lynn in her Halloween astronaut costume, Frank standing in front of the original sketch for the Dawson Current with his tool belt and that big mustache he used to have. He scanned them one by one, each click of the scanner unlocking a memory, a laugh, a sigh. He found the napkin sketch, the first one, yellowed and folded in the back of a notebook, drawn during a roadside diner lunch in 1989. Ellie had spilled ketchup on the corner. He scanned that too. The Zoom interview happened right there in the garage. Frank angled his laptop to show the inside of the RV, then stood in the doorway, holding his notebook. Rachel asked thoughtful questions, let him ramble when he needed to, and didn't once talk down to him. She called him a visionary. He chuckled at that. "I'm just a stubborn old man with a soldering iron." "That's what makes you dangerous," she said. The video went live 3 days later. He didn't even know it was up until his phone started buzzing like a hornet nest. Lynn called first. "Dad, are you famous?" she said, half laughing, half stunned. "I just saw your face on some YouTube video with 80,000 views." 92,000 now, Frank said, refreshing the page. The comments were pouring in. Thousands of them. People saying they cried. People tagging friends and saying, "This is what I want to do." Veterans. Widows. Teenagers. One person wrote, "I've been scared to start. Now I feel like I have permission." Another simply said, "He reminds me of my grandpa. I miss him." Lynn's voice softened. "Dad. I didn't get it before. But I think I do now." Frank swallowed hard. It's not about finishing the RV. It's about remembering I still can. "I know," she said. "I'm proud of you." The next morning, a man in a black Tesla pulled into Frank's driveway. He was young, maybe late 30s, wearing jeans and a windbreaker with the Tesla logo embroidered on the chest. He introduced himself as Darius, a field engineer from the company. "Saw your video," he said, gesturing toward the RV. "The folks at our regional office loved it. Thought I'd stop by, see if you needed any help getting that battery optimized." Frank stared, stunned. "You're from Tesla?" "Yup. I install commercial Powerwalls mostly. But this is cool." Together, they spent the day rechecking the system. Darius showed Frank a few optimization tricks, adjusted the inverter settings, and even brought a new interface panel, "Just something a little more efficient," he said with a grin. By sunset, the RV's electrical system was running smoother than ever. When Darius left, he shook Frank's hand firmly. "You're what we talk about in meetings, you know. We always say we want to change the world. You're the guy who's actually doing it." Frank didn't have words. Just a nod, a lump in his throat, and a sky turning purple above his house. That night, he couldn't sleep. Not out of anxiety, but from something electric in his chest, like his body couldn't contain the energy of everything that was happening. He got up, slipped on his jacket, and stepped into the RV. It was quiet inside, just the soft hum of the battery, the overhead light casting a warm glow on the plywood floor. He sat at the makeshift bench where he'd planned to build a tiny kitchenette and whispered aloud, "We're doing it, Ellie. It's finally happening." There was no voice in return. No breeze or creak of the frame. Just the steady, silent heartbeat of the future, pulsing through a machine that was no longer just a vehicle, but a vessel, for memory, for invention, for hope. The next day, he wrote on the whiteboard hanging by the garage door, Phase 2, Mobility. The battery worked. The lights worked. The roof was sealed. But the RV itself still couldn't move. The engine hadn't turned over in years, and he hadn't even opened the hood yet. That would be the next mountain. He wasn't worried. He'd find a way. Because now, for the first time in years, Frank Dawson didn't just have a project. He had momentum. He had people cheering him on. He had a future that didn't look like fading away, it looked like acceleration. Frank Dawson stood in front of the RV's hood like a man about to open a time capsule. The last time he'd looked under it, the Cold War was still on, gas was under $1, and Ellie was sitting in the passenger seat eating pistachios. That was over 3 decades ago. Now the paint was faded to a dusty chalk, the chrome trim rusted in patches, and the RV smelled like old vinyl, engine oil, and ghosts. He popped the latch and lifted the hood, wincing slightly at the creak of old hinges and the smell of dried coolant. Inside, the engine was a mess. Hoses brittle, belts frayed, rust in all the wrong places, like arthritis in metal. But it was all still there, still whole. Not beyond saving. He took a deep breath. "All right, let's see what we've got." That afternoon, he did nothing but assess. He photographed every component, labeled wires, drew diagrams in the back of his notebook, and ran through a checklist he hadn't used since 1995. He jacked the RV up just enough to check the undercarriage, crawled underneath with a flashlight between his teeth, and made a mental inventory of every problem he saw. There were a lot. Fuel line, cracked. Carburetor, gummed up. Radiator, maybe salvageable. Transmission, mystery box. Battery, dead as disco. But none of it scared him. Not like it would have 2 months ago. Back then, he was still unsure if this was all some desperate grasp for purpose. Now, it was clearly a mission. Not just to revive the RV, but to rewrite his own story. Every wire he traced, every bolt he unscrewed, was an act of rebellion against invisibility. The next morning, he called an old friend, Mike Turner, a former mechanic who used to run a shop off Route 18 before it shut down in 2012. They hadn't spoken in years, not out of bad blood, just time doing what time does. Frank wasn't even sure if the number still worked. But when Mike answered with that same gruff, yellow, it was like stepping into a familiar pair of boots. "Mike, it's Frank Dawson." A pause. Then, "Well, I'll be damned. You still breathing?" "Barely," Frank said. "You still turning wrenches?" "Only when my grandkids break their bikes." "What's up?" "I've got a Winnebago with a 30-year-old engine that needs resuscitation." A beat of silence. Then a slow laugh. "You're kidding." "Not even close." "You up for it?" "You got beer?" "Always." "I'll be there Saturday." When Mike arrived, he took one look at the RV and said, "This thing's uglier than a mule with mange." But there was a gleam in his eye. The two of them got to work immediately. Over the next 10 days, they became a team again, grunting, arguing, laughing like teenagers as they tore through the engine bay, sourcing parts online, rebuilding systems with a mix of vintage skill and modern tech. Frank would handle the electricals, Mike the mechanicals. They upgraded the fuel injection, swapped out the alternator, replaced the starter, cleaned the carb with a toothbrush and prayers. Frank even rewired the ignition to run a digital switch, because if I'm building the future, he said, I'm not turning a damn key. One day, while they were waiting for a part to arrive, Mike looked around the garage at all the solar gear, the battery setup, the half-installed waterless toilet system, and said, "You know this is nuts, right?" "Yup," Frank replied, tightening a bolt. "And you love it." Mike grinned. "Yeah, I kinda do." On the 12th day, they tried to start the engine. Frank sat in the driver's seat, hands hovering over the digital ignition panel he'd built from salvaged laptop parts. Mike stood outside, a wrench in one hand, his other on the hood like he could feel the old RV's heartbeat. Frank flipped the switch. Nothing. Then a soft click. Then, whir. The engine cranked once, coughed, and died. Frank looked at Mike through the windshield. Again. Mike nodded. Frank flipped it again. Crank. Cough. Crank. Rattle. Silence. One more. Crank. Crank. Roar. The engine sputtered, caught, then growled to life like a waking lion. Smoke puffed out the tailpipe, the whole RV shuddered like it was shaking off sleep, and Frank sat frozen behind the wheel, tears welling in his eyes, not just from the exhaust fumes but from the sheer disbelief of it. He looked at Mike, who was pumping his fists like a man who'd just won the lottery. "She's alive." Frank laughed, the sound cracking through his throat like a firework. He revved the engine once, gently, and felt the whole vehicle vibrate with power. "We did it." That night, they celebrated. Burgers on the grill. Cold beer. Mike brought an old Bluetooth speaker, and they played Springsteen and Seeger and everything else that made them feel young for 3 hours straight. Frank told stories about Ellie. Mike talked about his first car. They both agreed that no one over 60 was allowed to say the word TikTok. Around midnight, Mike looked at Frank and said, "You know, I thought you were losing it when you called. But now, I think you might be onto something." Frank raised his bottle. "To the crazy ones." Mike raised his. "To the second acts." The next morning, Frank rolled the RV slowly out of the driveway. He didn't take it far, just around the block. But every turn of the wheel felt like a lifetime regained. The solar panels gleamed in the sunlight. The Tesla battery pulsed with silent energy. The neighbors waved. Kids pointed. Someone even clapped. He pulled back into the driveway, heart pounding, not from fear, but from aliveness. He sat behind the wheel for a long time, engine off, hand resting on the dashboard like it was the shoulder of an old friend. He whispered, "We're not done yet." That night, the RV had a name. He painted it in navy blue block letters above the door, Current. Not just for electricity. Not just for the dream he and Ellie once drew on diner napkins. But for now. For the present moment. For moving forward. 2 days later, Rachel from Future Vision messaged him again. "Frank, I hope you're sitting down," she wrote. "Your episode hit 1.2 million views. We're getting messages from schools, retirement groups, veteran centers. Everyone wants to know more. Would you consider doing a live AMA next week?" Frank had to look up what AMA meant. When he found out it stood for Ask Me Anything, he almost declined. Then he thought of the kid in one of the comments who wrote, "I showed this to my grandpa. He cried. Now we're building a camper together." Frank said yes. The AMA went live the following Thursday. Frank wore his flannel shirt, sat in front of the RV, and answered questions for nearly 2 hours. "Did you think it would work?" someone asked. "No," he said. "That's why I did it." "What kept you going?" "Elon said we're here to break the system. I decided the system telling me to fade away was one worth breaking." "Are you an engineer?" "Not professionally. I'm a guy with a notebook and time." "Are you afraid of what's next?" Frank smiled at the camera. "Not anymore." That night, he got a message from someone who said their dad had lost his job at 67 and was depressed. After watching the video, they said, he picked up his tools again. He said, "If Frank Dawson can build a solar RV at 72, I can figure this out." Frank read it 5 times. Then he shut his laptop, stepped outside into the cool night, and looked up at the stars. They were the same stars he and Ellie used to lie under. The same sky he used to stare at while feeling like time was slipping away. But now he felt like he was rising. Frank Dawson awoke before dawn, the sky a pale wash of lavender behind his curtains. The RV, Current, sat in the driveway like a promise come true, its solar panels angled toward emerging light, the hum of the Tesla battery faint but alive. He didn't hurry. He didn't need to. Today wasn't just another tinkering day. It was the day he'd invited the neighborhood to see what possibility looked like when age wasn't the enemy. He made coffee, strong and black, and sat on the porch with it, breathing deep and marveling at how alive the air felt. Still soft and cool, it carried hope more than temperature. By mid-morning, people started to trickle in, the Boyle twins from across the street first, curious 8-year-olds with scraped knees and big eyes, followed by Mrs. Olmsted from 2 doors down, bringing cookies still warm from her oven, and Mr. Ramirez, a retiree and former high school teacher, leaning on his cane but moving up the driveway with surprising determination. They gathered around the RV, asking questions, pointing at cables, inspecting the panels. Frank welcomed them all, explaining what he'd done in simple terms, even for people who didn't know a diode from a soldering gun. He demonstrated how the solar cells worked, showed them the battery's interface, and flipped the light switch to let them hear the gentle hum of stored power. Somehow, the hum sounded like possibility. When he wasn't speaking, he watched faces, some stunned, some smiling, all alive. One of the twins tugged his sleeve. "Grandpa says old people aren't good at new stuff," she whispered. Frank crouched down to speak softly into her ear. "Well," he said, eyes glistening, "I think old people just have to believe they still can." That afternoon, Mike came by from his mechanic's shop with a young apprentice in tow, an aspiring electrician named Sharon who heard the story on the YouTube AMA. She wanted to learn. Frank showed her how he wired the LED, explained the battery management system, handed her a heat shrink tube, and the moment felt like passing the torch. Sharon's eyes lit when she got the solder just right. She looked up at Frank, breathing too loud, and said, "Thank you for believing someone my age can still learn from someone your age." Frank nodded, despite an ache in his knee. He realized right then that he'd built more than an RV, he'd sparked a network of intergenerational learning that made the afternoon glow brighter than any overhead lamp. Late in the day, he heard the drone of a car engine, followed by an unfamiliar door slam. He turned to see a local news van rolling into his driveway. The reporter, camera in hand, introduced herself, "Small crew, big smiles." They said they'd seen the AMA, the transformation of current, and wanted to film him explaining it all in person. Frank wasn't used to cameras, or attention, but something soft inside him said it was time. So he let them shoot, close-ups of his hands when he flipped the switch, sunrise reflected in his eyes, the panel-lit glow in the RV interior. Later that week, the local coverage aired and he watched it from his recliner, hands folded on his lap, the two small spotlights of the LED lighting that trailer interior dancing behind his eyes again. The neighbor's granddaughter showed him on her phone. She leaned forward and gasped, "You look like one of those people they say are too old to matter." He swallowed, and just smiled. That weekend, the community solar co-op invited him to speak at their town hall about DIY renewable projects. He stood at that old church hall podium in a worn flannel, voice steady, pressing on when he'd felt lighter might be easier. "If something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor," he told them. It was a line Elon Musk had said that stuck more every time he glanced at it. A young man raised his hand. "How did you get started?" He paused. "I got tired of fading away," he said. "I got tired of settling. So I started building again." That got the longest laugh of the night, but when the hall went quiet afterward, he looked out at faces lit by bulbs and felt something bigger than electricity thrumming in the air. On Monday, he received a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside, a small Polaroid photo of Ellie and him leaning on a red convertible, younger smiles in a younger place, and below it, in neat script, "We're proud of you." He stared at it for a long time, the edges curled like old regrets, until tears stung and he pressed it to his chest. That night, he dreamt of Ellie again, not ghost thin, but full and warm, watching him. He said her name in sleep and she nodded and said, "I always knew it was in you." He woke before dawn, and the sky was pink and real. He whispered into the waking world, "I'm back." The next project was bigger. The RV needed its plumbing replaced, the water system updated to be self-contained, and the insulation redone for winter warmth. He'd intended to hire someone, but then Sharon showed up again, sleeves rolled up, tools in hand. He introduced her to Mike. The three of them spent the week installing flexible piping, mounting a shower panel, and wrapping the walls in thermal barrier foil, working side by side, old and young and steadfast. When the heat held after the water began flowing, Frank realized the project was no longer about him or the RV. It was about tending the present and building what still mattered. Later that evening, he sat on the garage floor, hands pulsing from grip strength alone, and finger-painted script onto the plywood wall, "Nothing fades unless you let it." The words glowed in the battery-powered light and he felt whole again. He didn't know what the future held, the show, the next appointments, media requests, travel whispers, but he knew this, stove and shower and light, small-town people gathering small miracles. It was all enough. He rose, turned off the light and walked outside toward the night, where the stars felt the same but he, somehow, felt brand new. Frank Dawson woke before dawn to a sky painted in soft rose and lilac, the air still, as if the world was waiting with bated breath. The RV, Current, gleamed in the driveway under the early light, its solar panels catching the first sunbeams, and the hum from the Tesla battery was steady, a heartbeat of potential. He didn't move quick, rushing felt wrong today. He sipped his coffee out on the porch and watched the light shift from pink to gold, thinking about how far he'd come, from faded man to quiet conductor of a symphony of possibility. Today was the day. He'd invited the whole town to gather in his driveway, curious neighbors, skeptics, and people who didn't speak much but smiled kindly. By mid-morning, a parade of faces trickled in, Mrs. Green from the bakery, carrying cinnamon rolls still warm in her hands, the Johnson boys, curious and cautious, the mailman who always tipped his cap, even Bert the librarian, with his thick glasses sliding down his nose. Frank welcomed them as if they were heroes, not because they were, but because they needed to feel alive in that moment. He led them through the build process, describing how the panels tracked the sun, how the custom circuitry worked, how the Tesla battery stored energy like a beating heart. He flipped the switch and the RV glowed inside with cool LED light, powered entirely by rooftops and physics. Eyes widened. Children gasped. Someone whispered, "That's magic." Not rocket science, that felt like a lesson. This felt like reclaiming wonder. A teenage girl tugged his sleeve, voice shy. "My grandma always says old people can't learn new things." Frank knelt to meet her gaze, steady and bright. "Tell her this, old people just don't know they can until someone shows them they can." They shared a smile, and he felt something shift inside both of them. Then Mike pulled up with Sharon, the apprentice electrician whom Frank had mentored. She hovered by his side, eager, eyes bright. Frank let her talk him through the fuse array and explain how the battery management system protected against overheating, her words confident, clear. It felt like passing a torch from one era to the next. He watched her grasp the soldering iron, her hands steady like his used to be. He realized he hadn't just built an RV, he'd built a bridge. Around lunch, a local news crew arrived. They filmed the RV under morning light and slid microphones near Frank's face. He found himself speaking not just for himself but for a movement. "I didn't do this to get attention. I did it to show it's never too late to build, to learn, to matter." The broadcast aired that evening. Frank watched on his living room TV, colors from the RV's LEDs flickering across his face. His phone buzzed, messages from old friends, distant relatives, even strangers. One read, "You lit something in me, too." Another, "My dad lost his job last year, got depressed. He watched this and built a shed in his backyard again." Tears came quietly. He was less than a footnote in the news. But tonight, he felt enormous. A week later, the local community center invited him to speak at a meetings night. He stood before folding chairs under fluorescent lights, people leaning forward, leaning in, waiting for permission to hope. He said, "I built this RV because I refused to be told my story was over. And I'm not done yet." The hall was silent for a beat. Then came applause, not polite, but real and swelling. They clapped for him, for themselves, for the idea of second chances. At home that night a letter arrived, no return address, just his name scrawled across the front in looping script. Inside was a faded Polaroid, Ellie and him in front of that red convertible, both younger, arms slung across one another. On the back, her handwriting, elegant, "We're proud of you." Frank pressed it to his chest so long he could feel the weight of love and time all at once. That night he dreamed of Ellie, not pale and absent, but warm and vivid, stepping into the garage and setting her hand on his shoulder. She smiled and said, "You found your current." When he woke, sunrise peeked through his curtains, hopeful and alive. He whispered, "I'm back." The weeks became a blur of small miracles. The plumbing got revamped, modern, self-contained, with a solar-powered water heater. Sharon and Mike worked late installing insulation and piping, fiddled with each detail until the RV would be livable even in winter. When they flipped the hot water switch and heard the pump hum, Frank's eyes glowed like the inside of the RV itself. He painted a phrase on the plywood wall in bold, earnest strokes, "Nothing fades unless you let it." It soaked in the battery-powered light like a banner. That night, he stepped outside and gazed at the stars, same constellations he and Ellie used to stare at. But now, he felt brand new under them. He didn't know where it would all lead, maybe workshops for seniors, maybe tiny home kits, maybe an exhibit in a science museum someday. But he knew this, he still had chapters to come, pages to fill, and the dawn inside him felt as wide as the sky above. Frank Dawson woke before dawn, the sky a pale wash of lavender behind his curtains. The RV, Current, sat in the driveway like a promise come true, its solar panels angled toward emerging light, the hum of the Tesla battery faint but alive. He didn't hurry. He didn't need to. Today wasn't just another tinkering day, it was the day he'd invited the neighborhood to see what possibility looked like when age wasn't the enemy. He made coffee, strong and black, and sat on the porch with it, breathing deep and marveling at how alive the air felt. Still soft and cool, it carried hope more than temperature. By mid-morning, people started to trickle in. The Boyle twins from across the street first, curious 8-year-olds with scraped knees and big eyes, followed by Mrs. Olmsted from 2 doors down, bringing cookies still warm from her oven, and Mr. Ramirez, a retiree and former high school teacher, leaning on his cane but moving up the driveway with surprising determination. They gathered around the RV, asking questions, pointing at cables, inspecting the panels. Frank welcomed them all, explaining what he'd done in simple terms, even for people who didn't know a diode from a soldering gun. He demonstrated how the solar cells worked, showed them the battery's interface, and flipped the light switch to let them hear the gentle hum of stored power. Somehow, the hum sounded like possibility. When he wasn't speaking, he watched faces, some stunned, some smiling, all alive. One of the twins tugged his sleeve. "Grandpa says old people aren't good at new stuff," she whispered. Frank crouched down to her level, eyes glistening. "Tell him this, old people just have to believe they still can." The smile that followed felt like sunrise. By afternoon, Mike drove in with Sharon, the apprentice electrician he'd been training, a young woman bright-eyed and eager. Frank let her walk them through the fuse array and battery management system. She handled the soldering iron with precision and confidence that reminded Frank of his younger self. It was passing the torch in real time, and he felt a warmth that no solar cell could generate. Around lunch, a small news crew rolled in. Cameras, mics, big lights. Frank swallowed hard but let them film anyway, capturing him flipping switches, the LEDs glowing, the RV humming. They aired it that evening. Frank watched from his recliner, soft lamplight playing across his face. His phone buzzed non-stop, messages from old friends, distant relatives, strangers moved to write. One read, "You lit something in me, too." Another, "My dad lost his job, this inspired him to rebuild again." His eyes teared up. On Friday, they invited him to speak at the local community center. Under flickering fluorescent lights, he told them, "I built this RV because I refused to be told my story was over." Hands unfolded from folded posture, faces leaned in. When he finished, the applause wasn't polite, it was real. That night, a letter arrived. No return address. Inside, a faded Polaroid of him and Ellie leaning on a red convertible, younger, full of life. On the back, her elegant handwriting, "We're proud of you." He clutched it like a lifeline to love and time. He dreamt of Ellie again that night, warm, present, luminous. She stood in the garage and said, "You found your current." When he woke, the sky was dawn-blush beautiful. He whispered, "I'm back." Weeks folded into one another with small miracles. Sharon and Mike revamped the plumbing, installed water systems, wrapped insulation. When they turned on the hot water and heard the soft pump hum, Frank's eyes shone like the RV's interior light. He painted on plywood the words, "Nothing fades unless you let it." They glowed in the battery's light like a banner. That night, he stepped outside into the cool dark and looked up at the same stars he and Ellie had watched years before. But now he felt brand new under them. He didn't know what was next, tiny home kits, senior workshops, or museum displays, but he knew this, he still had chapters left, and the dawn inside him was as wide as the sky overhead. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The small town of Cedarville was beginning to stir with a quiet energy. News of Frank Dawson's RV-powered by Tesla battery project had spread like wildfire through word of mouth, social media shares, and the local news segment that played on repeat in diners and grocery stores. Frank himself was still processing the surreal shift that had transformed his life from invisible to influential. He had never asked for fame, all he wanted was purpose, and now it felt like he was carrying a spark that might light an entire forest. It started with neighbors. Mrs. Green, the bakery owner, approached him with a hesitant smile and a plan of her own. She wanted to install solar panels atop her shop. Could Frank help? She didn't know the first thing about electricity but was willing to learn. That week, Frank found himself teaching a small workshop in the community center, chalkboards filled with diagrams, battery specs, and solar potential calculations. He saw in the faces around him the same glimmer that had rekindled his own hope. The group was diverse, retirees like himself, young parents trying to reduce their carbon footprint, a few high school students eager for science credit. They asked questions, sometimes simple, sometimes complex, and Frank answered them patiently. Every question was a victory over fear, a crack in the wall of doubt. The town council caught wind of the movement. A young councilwoman named Sarah Patel invited Frank to speak at the upcoming town meeting. His voice was steady but his heart raced when he stood before the gathered crowd. He spoke about how technology, once seen as the domain of the young and gifted, could be embraced by everyone willing to challenge their limits. He spoke about Elon Musk's vision, about how the Tesla battery breakthrough wasn't just a tech marvel but a call to action, to rethink aging, energy, and purpose. The council voted unanimously to form a renewable energy task force, with Frank at its helm. Suddenly, the small project in his driveway was becoming a blueprint for the town's future. Frank felt the weight of responsibility but also a fierce surge of pride. One evening, as the sun set with a golden glow, Frank walked with Sharon and Mike to inspect the installation on Mrs. Green's bakery roof. The panels gleamed against the twilight, feeding energy into the new Tesla battery system Frank had helped wire. Sharon, always eager, shared plans she'd drawn up for a community battery bank. An idea that would store solar energy collectively, distributing power to homes during outages or peak demand. Mike, ever pragmatic, talked about how the project might create jobs, spark apprenticeships, and bring life back to Cedarville's declining economy. Frank's eyes twinkled with the promise of what could be. He thought back to the days when he felt irrelevant, lonely, and left behind. Now, surrounded by a team of all ages, working toward a common dream, he felt alive in a way he hadn't for decades. But change was never smooth. Not everyone was convinced. At the grocery store, a gruff man named Earl sneered when Frank mentioned solar panels. "Hogwash," he said. "Too expensive, too complicated. You're wasting your time." Frank nodded, keeping calm. "Maybe," he said, "but what if it's the future? What if it's a chance to do better for ourselves and our kids?" Earl snorted but didn't argue further. Sometimes seeds needed time to sprout. Meanwhile, Frank's own children remained distant. Calls were infrequent and often awkward, their skepticism a shadow that darkened his days. But he held on to Elon Musk's words he repeated to himself like a mantra: if something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. One evening, a breakthrough came unexpectedly. His daughter, Claire, called. The voice on the other end was tentative but warmer than before. "Dad, I saw the video about current. It's impressive. I'm sorry I doubted you." Frank's heart thudded. "Thank you, Claire. That means everything." They talked longer than usual. For the first time in years, a bridge was being rebuilt, fragile but real. As the weeks passed, the community project gained momentum. Frank coordinated with local electricians, volunteers, and the town council to set up solar panels on public buildings, creating microgrids that could sustain power independently. The Tesla batteries were at the core of this transformation, energy stored, shared, and managed with precision. Frank marveled at how Elon Musk's innovation was not just a gadget but a catalyst for renewal. One morning, Frank received an invitation to speak at a nearby university's sustainability conference. He was hesitant, the idea of stepping onto a big stage intimidated him. But Sharon encouraged him, reminding him of how far he'd come and how important his story could be. He agreed. Standing before a crowd of students, academics, and industry leaders, Frank told his story, from feeling invisible and beaten down by age and loss to building current and lighting a movement. He spoke about the Tesla battery breakthrough not as a miracle, but as a tool, something that could empower communities and individuals to reclaim control over their future. The audience responded with applause, some moved to tears. Afterwards, a young professor approached him, excited about collaborating to develop community energy projects modeled after Cedarville's success. Frank felt a thrill, this was bigger than himself. Back home, he kept pushing. He and Sharon began drafting plans for a mobile workshop, an updated current version designed to travel to nearby towns and teach others about renewable energy and DIY tech. He dreamed of a network of elder innovators, young learners, and communities reshaping their futures. But the biggest surprise came one crisp autumn evening when an unexpected visitor showed up on his porch. It was Ellie's sister, Marianne. They hadn't spoken in years, a rift caused by grief and misunderstanding. She held out a small box. "Ellie wanted you to have this," she said softly. Inside was a worn notebook filled with Ellie's handwriting, her sketches, ideas, and letters to Frank he never knew existed. Tears blurred his vision as he read through pages of hope, encouragement, and love. Ellie had believed in him even when he had lost faith in himself. Marianne smiled sadly. "She never stopped believing you'd find your way back." The notebook became Frank's compass. He carried it with him like a talisman, a reminder that legacy wasn't just about achievements but the people who believed in you, even from beyond. In the weeks that followed, Frank realized that Elon Musk's breakthrough was only the beginning, not just for energy, but for life itself. Age, loss, fear. They were not the end. They were the raw material for reinvention. The town's rooftop panels multiplied. Volunteers painted walls with solar decals. The sound of drills and laughter echoed through the streets. Cedarville was waking up, powered by the energy of possibility and the courage to begin again. Frank looked out one evening as the sunset painted the sky in deep oranges and purples. He thought of the journey, how one man's stubborn refusal to fade had become a beacon for others. The Tesla battery in current was more than technology. It was a symbol, a promise that the current of life, of purpose, of hope, could always flow anew. He smiled, knowing that the ripple effect had just begun. Frank Dawson sat at the kitchen table, the worn wood catching the afternoon light like an old friend welcoming him home. Across from him, Sharon spread blueprints and wiring diagrams, her youthful energy a stark contrast to the quiet steadiness in Frank's gray eyes. Together, they pored over plans for the new mobile workshop, the next evolution of current, a sleek, solar-powered vehicle designed not just to generate energy but to inspire connection across generations. The vision was simple but profound: bring the knowledge, tools, and hope of renewable energy to communities often forgotten, especially seniors who might feel left behind by rapid technological change. Sharon tapped her pen on the paper and looked up. "If we can make this accessible, hands-on, and community-driven, we can create ripples beyond Cedarville." Frank nodded, recalling Elon Musk's relentless belief that innovation was the key to solving humanity's greatest challenges, but only if people had access and belief. That afternoon, the town's high school science club showed up at Frank's garage, eager and wide-eyed. They didn't just want to watch, they wanted to build. Frank saw their curiosity as a bridge, young minds connecting to the experience and patience of age. For the first time, he realized that the gap between generations was not a chasm but a space waiting to be crossed with open hearts and shared purpose. He taught them how to solder, how to read circuits, how to think like inventors, not just consumers. The hours flew by as laughter, questions, and stories filled the air. One student, Jenny, shy at first, later confided that she'd always felt her future was predetermined, stuck between school and an uncertain job market. But seeing Frank, building and learning at 65, changed her perspective. "Maybe it's never too late for anything," she said quietly. Frank smiled. "It's never too late to begin." Meanwhile, the town council greenlit the first phase of the mobile workshop project, funding its build and approving routes to nearby communities. Frank was appointed director of outreach. Suddenly, he was no longer just a retired engineer with a dream, he was a leader, a mentor, a beacon. He and Sharon worked late into nights, tweaking designs, sourcing parts, and coordinating volunteers. Frank's hands, once stiff with age, grew nimble again with practice and purpose. He found that the Tesla battery wasn't just powering the workshop's lights, it was igniting something inside him. Outside the garage, the town was transforming. Rooftop solar panels multiplied like wildflowers in spring, community gardens grew under new LED grow lights powered by stored energy, and local businesses began conversations about sustainability and resilience. Frank's small idea was blooming into a movement. Yet, not all progress was smooth. Some longtime residents resisted the changes. They worried about costs, complexity, and disrupting a quiet way of life. Frank understood. Change was scary. But he also knew that fear often masked hope waiting to be uncovered. So, he made it his mission to listen more than he talked. He held informal gatherings in the town hall, listening to concerns, answering questions, and sharing stories of ordinary people reclaiming their power. Over time, suspicion softened into curiosity, and curiosity blossomed into participation. One memorable evening, Frank sat beside Mr. Ramirez on a bench overlooking the town square. The old teacher sighed, "You've stirred up something, Frank. I was skeptical, but now I'm planting solar panels on my roof. Feels like I'm part of something bigger." Frank clasped his shoulder. "That's the power of belief, my friend." Meanwhile, the bridge between Frank and his children continued to strengthen. Claire, now more engaged, came to one workshop, helping organize materials and encouraging younger attendees. The walls that once divided them seemed to dissolve with each shared moment and story. Frank reflected on Elon Musk's words about perseverance and purpose: when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. He realized that for him, purpose was no longer a distant dream but a daily reality lived through connections and action. The mobile workshop finally rolled out on a crisp morning, sunlight bouncing off its sleek solar panels. Frank stood beside Sharon as the community gathered for the send-off, faces alight with pride and possibility. The vehicle was more than a machine, it was a message: no one was too old to change, too small to matter, or too late to begin anew. As the workshop moved from town to town, Frank witnessed something profound. Elders who'd felt forgotten found new hope. Young people discovered mentors and inspiration. Communities built resilience and dreams together. One evening, Frank received a call from a distant relative. "Dad, I've been watching. I want to help." It was his son, David, reconnecting after years of silence. Frank's heart swelled. The journey wasn't just about technology, it was about healing, bridging, and belonging. That night, under the stars, Frank thought of Ellie and the notebook Marianne had given him. Her words echoed through his mind: "You were never too old. You were just waiting for permission to matter again." Frank smiled and whispered, "I gave myself permission." He looked up, the sky vast and shimmering, feeling the current of life flow strong and true, carrying him forward into a future he was still writing, one connection, one breakthrough, one spark at a time. Frank Dawson sat alone in his dimly lit garage late into the evening, the soft glow of the Tesla battery interface pulsing gently like a heartbeat in the darkness. The day's energy, a whirlwind of meetings, workshops, and conversations, had left him drained yet strangely restless. Despite the growing movement in Cedarville and beyond, a familiar weight crept in, pressing on his chest with cold fingers: doubt. It was a quiet visitor, but persistent. Was he really making a difference? Was this all just a fleeting moment, destined to fade like so many dreams before? Age whispered its usual refrain: too late, too tired, too irrelevant. He glanced at the notebook Ellie's sister had given him, its worn pages filled with his late wife's handwriting, words of encouragement, ideas they once dreamed of building together. Her faith in him was a warm ember in the cold night, but even that wasn't always enough to keep the shadows at bay. His phone buzzed, a message from Claire. "Dad, you're amazing. Don't let the noise get to you." Frank smiled weakly. She was right, but sometimes the noise wasn't outside, it was inside. He leaned back, eyes closing as memories flooded in, years of missed chances, strained relationships, the slow fade of youth and purpose. But then, as if summoned by his struggle, a notification popped up on his tablet: a new interview with Elon Musk. The words hit him like a jolt: when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. Elon's voice echoed through the room, fearless, unyielding, full of relentless belief. Frank's fingers tightened around the edge of the chair. That was the spark, reminder and challenge. The journey wasn't about perfection, it was about persistence. Next morning, Frank decided to confront his doubts head-on. He organized a real talk session at the community center, an open forum for anyone wrestling with fears about change, aging, and purpose. The turnout surprised him: elders, young people, skeptics, supporters, all gathered to share their stories. When it was his turn, Frank spoke with honesty: "I won't pretend I'm fearless. Some days, the doubts weigh heavy. But I choose to keep moving because what we're building is bigger than me." A woman named Linda, retired nurse, nodded. "I thought I was done after I lost my husband. Now, this community, this energy, it's waking me up." Others shared fears about being forgotten, about technology moving too fast. Frank listened, then responded with stories of his own struggles and breakthroughs. The room shifted from tension to connection. Frank realized that doubt wasn't the enemy, it was a part of the journey, a shadow that made the light more precious. Inspired by the conversation, Frank and Sharon launched a monthly newsletter titled Current Conversations, sharing stories of hope, practical tips for renewable energy projects, and messages of encouragement. The newsletter spread beyond Cedarville, reaching curious readers in neighboring towns and even states away. Each issue carried Elon Musk's spirit, challenging limits, embracing failure as fuel, and lighting fires of possibility. One afternoon, while working on the mobile workshop solar array, Frank received a surprise visitor: Earl, the gruff man who had once dismissed the project as hogwash. Earl's rough voice was softer this time. "I want to learn. Maybe I was wrong." Frank felt a swell of gratitude. "Welcome aboard." Together, they soldered, measured, and learned side by side, bridging years of skepticism with shared purpose. As autumn deepened, the community faced its first real challenge: a powerful storm knocked out power across Cedarville for 2 days. Thanks to the Tesla battery systems, homes with installations kept their lights on, refrigerators running, and phones charged. Neighbors without systems gathered at Frank's home and the community center, where the battery banks powered heaters and lights. In the dark and cold, the town found warmth not just in electricity but in solidarity. Frank stood by the window, watching neighbors sharing food and stories, children playing by flashlight beams. It was a testament to resilience, proof that the movement he'd sparked was more than technology, it was heart. In those quiet moments, he felt Ellie's presence, as if she stood beside him, proud and strong. The next day, the local paper ran a front-page story titled, "Power in Community, How Cedarville Weathered the Storm." Frank's face smiled from the page, but more importantly, the article told the story of a town refusing to be left behind. Later that week, Frank's son David called again. This time, they talked for nearly an hour, not just about the project but about life, regret, and hope. Frank shared his doubts, and David admitted his own fears. The conversation was messy, honest, and healing. As winter settled, Frank found new energy in the rhythms of community and purpose. He wrote in his journal, quoting Elon Musk, "Persistence is very important. You should not give up unless you are forced to give up." For Frank, giving up was no longer an option. The path ahead was uncertain, full of challenges, but it was alive. He felt ready to face whatever came next, not as a man defeated by age but as one propelled by the power of hope, innovation, and the unbreakable current of human connection. The sharp chill of winter had settled over Cedarville, blanketing the town in quiet snow that softened the familiar streets and muffled the usual sounds. Inside his workshop, Frank Dawson was bent over a tangle of wires and circuit boards, his breath visible in the cold air. The mobile workshop had been upgraded with new components sourced from a network of makers and engineers he'd connected with online. Despite the progress, Frank felt the familiar stir of fatigue, the weight of years pressing on his shoulders. Then, the phone rang, a number he didn't recognize. "Hello, Frank Dawson," a polite, firm voice asked. "This is Laura Jennings from the State Department of Energy. We've been following your work with great interest." Frank's heart skipped. Government attention was a double-edged sword. "Thank you," he said cautiously. Laura's voice was steady but warm. "We believe your project, the Community Battery Initiative, the mobile workshop, has potential beyond Cedarville. We'd like to explore ways to support and scale your efforts." Frank blinked, the moment catching him off guard. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Laura smiled. "You've sparked a movement rooted in innovation and resilience. We want to help bring that to more towns facing similar challenges." That call was the beginning of a new chapter, one that thrust Frank into a realm of policy meetings, grant applications, and collaborations with officials and scientists he never imagined crossing paths with. At first, the bureaucratic maze was daunting. Frank was no stranger to complexity, but this world moved at a different pace, rules and red tape often stifling momentum. Sharon became his anchor, helping him navigate paperwork and strategize partnerships. Frank remembered Elon Musk's words about pushing through obstacles that seemed impossible. "If you want to change the world, you have to be willing to swim upstream," Elon had said. And swim upstream Frank did. At a conference in the state capitol, Frank presented Current's impact on Cedarville, a story of transformation powered by Tesla's battery innovation and community grit. The room was filled with policymakers, industry leaders, and media. Frank's voice carried not just facts and figures but passion and hope. "This isn't just about technology," he said. "It's about reclaiming our power, literally and figuratively. It's about proving that age, geography, or resources don't define what we can achieve together." His message resonated. Afterward, a prominent energy scientist approached him. Dr. Priya Sharma, whose groundbreaking work in battery chemistry was renowned, extended an invitation to collaborate. Together, they began brainstorming ways to optimize the mobile workshop's technology, making it even more efficient and adaptable for different climates and communities. Meanwhile, Cedarville thrived. The town's energy independence became a model, attracting attention from neighboring counties and nonprofits. The mobile workshop traveled farther, reaching places where skepticism met curiosity and often ended in enthusiasm. One day, Frank received a letter from an elderly man in Montana, who wrote about how the workshop had inspired him to retrofit his farm with solar panels and batteries. "You gave me hope when I thought it was too late," the letter said. Frank kept it pinned to his workshop wall, a reminder of the ripple effect spreading quietly across the country. Yet, challenges persisted. Some critics accused the project of being idealistic, unsustainable without massive funding. Frank faced moments of discouragement but found strength in the growing network of allies, people from all walks of life who believed in the vision. In the midst of this whirlwind, a surprise visit from Claire brought a fresh wave of encouragement. She'd taken a job with a renewable energy nonprofit and was eager to work alongside her father. Their collaboration was more than professional, it was healing. Late one night, as snowflakes drifted outside, Frank and Claire sat by the fireplace, discussing the future. "Dad, this movement you started, it's bigger than any of us. But it's also deeply personal." Frank nodded, grateful for the bond rekindled. He thought of Ellie again, the woman who believed in him when he didn't believe in himself, and realized the legacy he was building was as much about family as it was about energy. The state's support grew into a formal program to fund community battery initiatives across rural America, inspired by Cedarville's success. Frank was appointed to advise on policy, representing the voice of everyday innovators and elders refusing to be sidelined. His journey from retired engineer to national advocate was astonishing. But Frank never forgot the spark. The Tesla battery breakthrough, Elon Musk's fearless mindset, and the small moments of courage that had propelled him forward. One spring morning, standing beneath budding trees in Cedarville's town square, Frank addressed a crowd gathered to celebrate the launch of the statewide initiative. His voice was steady and filled with conviction. Change is never easy. It's a path filled with doubt, setbacks, and fear. But it's also a path of hope, connection, and power to redefine what's possible, no matter our age or circumstances. The crowd erupted in applause. Frank looked out at the faces, young and old, familiar and new, and felt the current of life flowing stronger than ever. The breakthrough that started in a small garage with a Tesla battery had become a beacon lighting a brighter future for America's heartlands. And Frank Dawson, once a man struggling with purpose, had become a symbol of resilience and transformation. The unexpected ally, the government, the scientists, the community, had come together not because of a single breakthrough, but because of a shared belief that innovation was for everyone, at every stage of life. As the sun rose higher, warming the town square, Frank smiled, knowing the journey was far from over. But now, he wasn't walking it alone. The late spring air buzzed softly with the hum of life as Frank Dawson stood outside the community center, watching a crowd gather for the latest current workshop rollout. The excitement was tangible, the kind of energy that refused to be dampened by years or setbacks. Frank's hands, weathered but steady, clutched a steaming cup of coffee as he scanned the faces, some familiar, many new. Drawn together by a shared hope that innovation could spark a new beginning. The Tesla battery technology had become more than a power source, it was a symbol of possibility, a beacon for those who had long felt invisible, too old, or too worn to matter. Yet persistence, more than technology, was the real current flowing beneath this movement. Frank thought back to the earliest days, when doubt and fear threatened to drown his efforts. He remembered Elon Musk's words echoing in his mind during moments of despair: persistence is very important. You should not give up unless you are forced to give up. Frank had refused to be forced. That refusal had carried him through late-night soldering circuits, countless community meetings, and the sting of skepticism from neighbors and family alike. Today was a milestone, but the journey was far from over. As the workshop began, Frank took the stage, his voice clear and filled with conviction. We're here not just to build technology, but to build belief, in ourselves, our communities, and our futures. Among the crowd was Sarah, a retired schoolteacher who had once told Frank she thought she was too old to learn new things. Now, she was leading a local group installing solar panels on senior centers. Nearby, a group of teenagers assembled battery modules under Sharon's guidance, their eyes bright with curiosity and pride. Frank watched as generations learned side by side, bridging divides that had seemed insurmountable. But persistence had its costs. Frank's body sometimes ached from the relentless pace, and moments of self-doubt still surfaced in quiet evenings. He had learned that hope wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to keep moving despite it. A letter arrived one afternoon from a small town in Ohio, where a group of seniors had replicated Current's model to power their community center and local homes. They spoke of newfound independence and connection. Frank pinned the letter to his wall beside Ellie's notebook, a mosaic of proof that persistence paid off. In the quiet of his workshop, Frank often reflected on the transformation, not just of the town or technology, but of himself. The man who once felt invisible, overshadowed by age and regret, now stood as a mentor and pioneer. His relationship with Claire had blossomed into a partnership, both personal and professional, healing old wounds and creating new foundations. The persistence that Elon Musk embodied was mirrored in Frank's own story. Persistence was not just about fighting against odds. It was about embracing change, learning from failure, and refusing to settle for less than purpose. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Frank sat beside Sharon and shared his worries about the future. What if this all fades? What if we hit a wall we can't break through? Sharon smiled, her eyes steady. Then we break it down and build a new one. That's what you've taught us. It was a moment of quiet clarity, the understanding that persistence was a community effort, fueled by shared courage and commitment. As summer approached, Frank received an invitation to speak at a national conference on renewable energy innovation. Standing before a packed auditorium, he told his story, of setbacks, breakthroughs, and the power of community. He spoke of Elon Musk's spark, but emphasized the collective effort it took to keep that spark alive. The audience responded with standing ovations, moved by the truth in his words. Returning to Cedarville, Frank felt a renewed sense of purpose. The mobile workshop was scheduled to expand into underserved rural areas nationwide, carrying with it the promise of empowerment and connection. Frank's persistence had grown into a movement. One quiet morning, Frank found a package on his doorstep, a book of letters and stories from people across the country who had been touched by the current project. As he read through the pages, tears blurred his vision. Each story was a testament to the ripple effect of persistence, a grandmother powering her home, a community center buzzing with life, a young girl inspired to pursue engineering. Frank realized that persistence was more than endurance, it was transformation in motion, a force that could change lives and landscapes alike. That night, as he wrote in his journal, Frank quoted Elon Musk one last time, "Some people don't like change, but you need to embrace change if the alternative is disaster." Frank smiled, knowing he had embraced change, and in doing so, had found a new beginning that was only just unfolding. The early morning sun cast long shadows across Cedarville's Main Street, where the community center was alive with the hum of activity. Frank Dawson stood at the entrance, watching as a group of teenagers and elders worked side by side, assembling battery modules and solar panels for the next current deployment. The sight stirred something deep inside him. A sense of hope woven through the threads of generations once thought too distant to connect. It was hard to believe this vibrant scene had emerged from the quiet, hesitant steps he had taken months ago. Age, once a barrier, was now a bridge. Frank remembered a time not long ago when the gap between young and old felt unbridgeable. His own children had struggled to understand his passion for this project, while many in his generation saw technology as a foreign language spoken by others. But through persistence and openness, those walls had begun to crumble. The Tesla battery technology was the catalyst, but the real magic was in the relationships it forged. Sharon called Frank over as a young girl named Mia asked questions about battery storage and energy flow. "She's curious," Sharon smiled. "Reminds me of you when you were her age." Frank chuckled softly, kneeling beside Mia. "Ask all the questions you want. That's how we learn." The exchange was simple but profound. Knowledge, once locked behind years and skepticism, was now shared freely across ages. The community center had become a hub, not just for energy innovation, but for connection, learning, and mutual respect. Over the weeks, Frank and Sharon organized workshops that paired seniors with youth, encouraging them to teach and learn from one another. The teenagers brought fresh ideas and enthusiasm, while the elders offered wisdom and experience. Together, they built not only battery packs but bonds. One afternoon, during a particularly lively session, Claire arrived with a group of college students interested in sustainable energy. She introduced a project to design user-friendly apps that could monitor and optimize home battery use, making technology accessible to all ages. Frank watched as the room buzzed with collaboration, a symphony of voices blending ideas and laughter. He felt a swell of pride and gratitude. This was the future he had dreamed of, one where age was not a limitation but a layer of strength. Yet bridging generations wasn't without its challenges. Some elders resisted the fast pace, overwhelmed by jargon and devices. Some youths struggled to appreciate the patience and perspective their mentors brought. Frank and Sharon worked patiently to foster empathy and understanding, creating spaces where frustration could be voiced and resolved. It was in these moments that Frank thought of Elon Musk's fearless approach, not just in technology but in breaking norms and barriers. Elon had shown that innovation required daring to disrupt the status quo, even when uncomfortable. Cedarville's new generation of innovators embodied that spirit. At a town hall meeting, Frank shared stories of the intergenerational workshops, urging the community to embrace collaboration as a path forward. "We all bring something valuable to the table," he said. "When we listen and learn from each other, we create solutions that are stronger and more lasting." The response was overwhelmingly positive, signaling a shift in mindset. Inspired by the momentum, Frank helped establish a mentorship program pairing retirees skilled in trades like carpentry, electrical work, and mechanics with young apprentices eager to learn. The program not only built practical skills but renewed a sense of purpose among participants. Frank often thought of Ellie, imagining her smiling at the thriving community they had helped inspire. The mentorship initiative became a model, attracting attention from nearby towns and even state officials looking for ways to combat youth unemployment and senior isolation. The mobile workshop adapted to include training modules for the program, traveling to schools and senior centers to spread the message. One crisp autumn day, Frank received an invitation from a national foundation focused on aging and innovation. They wanted to highlight Cedarville's approach as a case study in how technology and community could work together to empower all generations. Frank accepted, knowing this was another step toward changing the narrative around aging and relevance. The event brought together experts, policymakers, and advocates, all eager to learn from Cedarville's example. Frank spoke passionately about the power of connection and the importance of valuing every voice. "Our strength lies in our diversity, not just in backgrounds or skills, but in age and experience. When we bridge those gaps, we unlock potential that benefits us all." After the event, Frank met with a woman named Margaret, a gerontologist who had studied social isolation among seniors. She shared research supporting the idea that meaningful engagement across generations improved mental health and community resilience. Their conversation sparked plans for further collaboration, blending science and grassroots innovation. Back in Cedarville, life buzzed with renewed energy. The mentorship program flourished, and the community's confidence in its ability to adapt and grow deepened. Frank found himself less focused on his own doubts and more inspired by the collective journey. One evening, after a successful workshop, Frank sat on his porch with Claire and Sharon, watching the stars emerge in the clear sky. "I never thought I'd see a day when age brought people together like this," Claire said softly. Frank smiled, feeling the truth of her words settle like a warm blanket. It's what happens when we refuse to accept limits others set for us. We build new paths, together. As the night deepened, Frank felt a profound sense of peace. The Tesla battery breakthrough had sparked a revolution in energy, but it was the breakthrough in human connection that had changed everything. The current that flowed through Cedarville was more than electricity, it was hope, resilience, and a testament to the power of bridging generations. The cold reality of a gray morning settled over Frank Dawson as he stared at the growing stack of bills on his kitchen table. Despite the momentum and the growing network of supporters, the financial strain was real and relentless. Grants were delayed, donations fluctuated, and unexpected costs for materials and travel added up quickly. The optimism that had fueled his journey now battled against the creeping doubt that perhaps this dream was slipping out of reach. He remembered a line from Elon Musk during a difficult phase in SpaceX's early years: "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." Those words echoed like a lifeline, but the weight of doubt pressed heavily. Frank's body ached, not just from age, but from the constant push to keep everything moving forward. The community depended on him, but he wondered if his strength was enough. Claire noticed the change first: the shadows under his eyes, the silence in his usually steady voice. "Dad," she said one evening, "you can't carry this alone." Her words hit harder than she knew. Frank had always prided himself on self-reliance, but now, he had to admit the truth. The journey wasn't just about persistence, it was about support, trust, and sometimes, letting go. The next day, Frank called a meeting with Sharon and the advisory team. "We need to face the numbers honestly," he said. "If we don't find new funding soon, Current's expansion will stall." The room was tense but determined. Ideas flowed, from crowdfunding campaigns to partnerships with local businesses, but the path forward was uncertain. As Frank grappled with the financial crunch, he found solace in a small, unexpected moment. At the workshop, a young volunteer named Marcus, who had recently joined after hearing Frank's story, quietly handed him a note. It read, "Your work gave me a second chance. Keep going." The simple message rekindled a spark within Frank, a reminder that this project was bigger than dollars and cents. It was about lives transformed and futures reclaimed. Determined to find a solution, Frank reached out to Laura Jennings at the Department of Energy. Their conversation was candid. "We want to help, but budgets are tight," Laura admitted. "However, there's growing interest in public-private partnerships, especially with companies looking to fulfill sustainability goals." That led Frank to an unexpected meeting with a regional energy corporation considering investments in community-based projects. It was a delicate dance, balancing corporate interests with the grassroots spirit of Current. Frank was wary but hopeful. Meanwhile, whispers of criticism began to surface in local media, voices questioning whether such ambitious projects were sustainable or just a fleeting trend. Frank heard the murmurs, felt the sting, but refused to let doubt silence the truth he had seen. He remembered Elon Musk's relentless drive despite naysayers and pushed forward with renewed vigor. The mounting pressure tested relationships. Sharon suggested taking a step back to focus on well-being, but Frank's fear of losing momentum made him hesitant. Claire urged him to delegate more, to trust the growing team. Slowly, Frank began to accept that leadership was not about doing everything alone but empowering others to carry the torch. One rainy afternoon, Frank visited a nearby town where Current had recently launched a pilot program. He met with residents whose lives had been touched. Families now free from crippling energy bills, seniors able to stay comfortably in their homes, kids dreaming of futures in green technology. Their stories fortified his resolve. Back home, Frank started a blog, sharing candid reflections on the struggles and triumphs of leading Current. His authenticity resonated with readers across the country, sparking conversations about resilience, aging, and innovation. Donations and volunteer sign-ups began to trickle in, proving that vulnerability could be a powerful catalyst. One evening, as Frank prepared for bed, he stumbled upon a live stream of Elon Musk addressing a tough setback in his latest venture. Elon's words were raw and unfiltered: "Failure is an option here. If things are not failing, you are not innovating enough." Frank smiled, feeling a kinship across the miles and years. Failure was not the enemy, stagnation was. With renewed determination, Frank rallied his team. They revamped fundraising efforts, strengthened partnerships, and embraced creative solutions to stretch every dollar. The community's belief in Current became a fortress against doubt. Through the trials, Frank realized that doubt was a natural companion on the path to change. It demanded courage, resilience, and above all, faith in the journey. He wasn't just building batteries, he was building a movement powered by the collective will to redefine what was possible, no matter the odds. As spring blossomed, Frank stood before a new group of volunteers, sharing his story, the victories and the setbacks alike. If you're feeling the weight of doubt, you're not alone, he said. But remember, every breakthrough begins with someone who refuses to quit. The room filled with nods and smiles, the current of hope stronger than ever. Frank Dawson, once burdened by uncertainty, had transformed doubt into fuel, propelling a revolution that was just beginning to shine. The horizon glowed with the soft blush of dawn as Frank Dawson stood on the edge of Cedarville's hilltop, the sprawling town below slowly waking to a new day. The air carried the crisp scent of spring, mingled with the faint hum of solar panels quietly converting sunlight into power. It was a moment of quiet triumph for Frank, a man who had journeyed from doubt to determination, from isolation to community. This was more than just a physical place, it was the embodiment of a vision sparked by a breakthrough battery technology and sustained by human persistence. Frank's gaze lingered on the rooftops, many now adorned with the sleek panels powered by Tesla's revolutionary battery packs. What had started as a dream in his cluttered garage had blossomed into a living, breathing network of energy independence and hope. The community's transformation was palpable. Streets that once darkened early now shimmered with light, and the hum of powered homes filled the night air with a comforting pulse. Frank felt the weight of years lift, replaced by the exhilarating possibility of what lay ahead. He recalled the early days when skepticism and fear loomed large, when the future seemed uncertain and his own body betrayed signs of age. But here, standing in the dawn's embrace, those fears felt distant. The breakthrough had not only altered the town's energy landscape but shifted its spirit. Frank's thoughts drifted to Claire and Sharon, partners in this journey whose unwavering support had made the impossible tangible. Together, they had built bridges across generations and communities, turning innovation into a collective force for change. The success wasn't just measured in kilowatt-hours saved or bills reduced, but in lives renewed. Families once burdened by high energy costs now enjoyed warmth and security. Seniors who feared losing independence found new tools to stay in their homes comfortably. Young people, inspired by the possibilities, pursued studies and careers in sustainability and engineering. Cedarville was becoming a beacon of hope, a model for towns across the nation. News of their achievements had caught the attention of state and federal officials, leading to invitations to speak at energy summits and participate in policy discussions. Frank had learned to navigate these new arenas, his voice carrying the wisdom of experience and the passion of a man who refused to be sidelined by age. Yet, even as the town thrived, Frank remained grounded in the reality that the journey was ongoing. The battery technology was a breakthrough, but true change required constant innovation and adaptation. He spent hours in his workshop, tinkering with new designs, exploring ways to improve efficiency and accessibility. The lessons learned from failures and setbacks had taught him humility and resilience. One afternoon, as he worked on a prototype for a more compact, user-friendly battery unit, Claire entered with news. "We've been invited to partner with a national utility company," she said, eyes shining with excitement. "They want to pilot our system in several rural communities struggling with energy access." The opportunity was a testament to the project's impact, but it also brought new challenges. Scaling the model meant navigating complex regulations, corporate interests, and diverse community needs. Frank welcomed the challenge, seeing it as a chance to extend the breakthrough beyond Cedarville's borders. The months that followed were a whirlwind of meetings, planning sessions, and hands-on workshops. Frank traveled extensively, sharing the story of Cedarville and demonstrating the battery technology's potential. He met with farmers in remote areas, tribal leaders seeking sustainable solutions, and educators eager to incorporate renewable energy into their curricula. Everywhere he went, he encountered skepticism tempered by curiosity, and a growing readiness to embrace change. In one town, a community elder spoke candidly about fears of losing cultural traditions amidst modernization. Frank listened carefully, understanding that technology must honor identity as much as innovation. Together, they crafted programs that blended renewable energy education with cultural preservation, building trust and partnership. Back home, Sharon and Claire managed the growing volunteer network, ensuring the heart of the movement remained in community connection. Frank marveled at how the project had evolved, from a personal quest to a national movement fueled by countless hands and hearts. As summer waned, Frank received a letter from Elon Musk himself. The note was brief but profound: keep pushing boundaries. Your work matters. The message, a quiet affirmation from the man whose vision had ignited so much, filled Frank with renewed energy. He pinned the letter above his workbench, a daily reminder that age was not a limit but a lens through which to see the world differently. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Frank gathered with friends and neighbors for a community celebration. Lanterns floated above, casting a warm glow over faces illuminated by gratitude and hope. Stories were shared, of breakthroughs and setbacks, of losses and gains, of the journey from doubt to discovery. Frank felt deeply connected, part of something larger than himself. The breakthrough battery had changed America's energy future, but it had also changed one man's future, one town's story, and countless lives touched along the way. As the night deepened, Frank looked up at the stars, feeling the vastness of possibility stretching before him. The new horizon was not just a place, but a promise, a future shaped by courage, innovation, and the enduring power of community. Frank Dawson sat quietly in his workshop, the soft glow of LED lights casting long shadows on walls lined with blueprints and battery cells. The hum of a small fan was the only sound, mingling with distant echoes of children playing outside. As he pieced together a new battery prototype, Frank reflected on how far the current project had come. It had started as a small idea fueled by frustration and hope, but now, its impact was rippling far beyond Cedarville. He thought about the community gatherings, the intergenerational mentorships, the new jobs created, and the energy independence achieved. But the true measure of success was in the unseen ways, the shifts in mindset, the seeds of change planted in hearts and minds across the country. Frank recalled an email from a teacher in Kansas, describing how her students had launched a local solar initiative inspired by Cedarville's story. Another message came from a retiree in Maine, who had started a volunteer group helping seniors install battery systems in their homes. These were not isolated incidents, they were threads in a growing tapestry of transformation. The ripple effect was undeniable. The breakthrough Tesla battery, with its unprecedented efficiency and affordability, had become more than technology, it was a symbol of possibility. It challenged assumptions about age, ability, and community, proving that innovation could be inclusive and empowering. Yet, with growth came complexity. Frank found himself navigating the delicate balance between maintaining the grassroots spirit of current and managing increasing attention from investors, media, and policymakers. Each step forward demanded careful consideration to preserve the project's core values. During a conference in Washington, D.C., Frank met with leaders from various sectors: energy, education, government, each eager to replicate Cedarville's success. He shared candid stories of trial and error, emphasizing that the journey was as important as the destination. It's not just about technology, he told the audience. It's about people, listening, learning, and growing together. Back home, the team faced new challenges: supply chain disruptions, technical glitches, and community skepticism in unfamiliar regions. Frank leaned on the resilience built over years, encouraging his team to view obstacles as opportunities for creativity and collaboration. One afternoon, a call came from a young entrepreneur named Jasmine, who was launching a social enterprise to bring energy solutions to underserved urban neighborhoods. Her passion and vision reminded Frank of his own beginnings. They agreed to partner, blending Jasmine's grassroots outreach with Current's technical expertise. This collaboration opened new doors, proving that the ripple effect was fueled by diverse voices united by a common purpose. As the project expanded, Frank noticed a change in himself. Where once he had felt the weight of responsibility alone, he now embraced the power of collective effort. He saw elders teaching youth, neighbors sharing resources, and strangers becoming allies. The breakthrough battery had ignited a movement that transcended technology. On a quiet evening, Frank sat with Sharon and Claire, reviewing letters and stories from communities touched by Current. Tears welled as they read about families freed from energy poverty, students inspired to pursue STEM careers, and seniors rediscovering independence. These stories were the true battery, the energy sustaining their work. Frank's thoughts turned to Elon Musk, whose daring vision had sparked this revolution. But it was the countless everyday heroes, volunteers, teachers, advocates, who kept the current flowing. The ripple effect was their collective triumph. As night settled over Cedarville, Frank stepped outside, the stars shimmering like distant promises. He breathed deeply, feeling the pulse of a world awakening to new possibilities. The breakthrough battery was more than a technology, it was a beacon lighting the way toward a future defined by hope, connection, and the enduring power of human spirit. Dark clouds gathered over Cedarville as Frank Dawson stood at the window of his modest home, watching the first drops of rain splatter against the glass. The approaching storm was more than a weather event, it was a symbol of the challenges looming over the current project. Despite months of progress, recent setbacks had threatened to unravel much of what they had built. Supply chain disruptions delayed critical battery components. Key funding sources pulled back amid economic uncertainty. And worst of all, a major data breach compromised sensitive information, shaking the community's trust. Frank felt the weight of responsibility like never before. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil within, a fierce test of resilience and leadership. The once bright momentum now flickered under pressure, and Frank wrestled with a familiar question: could they weather this storm? In the quiet before the tempest, Frank gathered with Sharon and Claire in the workshop. "We knew it wouldn't be easy," Sharon said, her voice steady despite the worry in her eyes. "But we can't let this break us." Claire nodded, pulling up contingency plans on her laptop. "We have to be transparent. The community needs to hear from us directly." Frank agreed, recognizing that honesty and openness were their strongest shields. That evening, he composed a heartfelt letter to Cedarville, acknowledging the difficulties but reaffirming their shared commitment. "This storm is a test, not a verdict," he wrote. "Together, we will find a way forward." The next morning, Frank held a town hall meeting. Faces were tense, the air thick with uncertainty. Some voices questioned the project's viability. Others expressed fear about privacy and security. Frank listened without interruption, then spoke with calm resolve. "Innovation always comes with risks," he said. "But our strength is in community. We will learn, adapt, and emerge stronger." To rebuild trust, the team implemented enhanced security measures and launched a series of workshops on data privacy and energy literacy. Volunteers reached out personally to those affected, bridging gaps with empathy and care. Meanwhile, Frank and Claire worked tirelessly to secure alternative suppliers, navigating complex negotiations to keep production on track. The setbacks forced the team to rethink assumptions and embrace flexibility, turning obstacles into opportunities for growth. One afternoon, as the storm finally broke and sunlight filtered through the clouds, Frank received an unexpected call from an old friend and mentor, David. "I've been watching your journey," David said. "You remind me of something Elon said: when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are against you. Don't lose sight of why you started." The words rekindled Frank's resolve. He realized the storm was not a barrier but a crucible, forging resilience and innovation. With renewed energy, Frank rallied his team, emphasizing the lessons learned and the importance of perseverance. The community, inspired by their transparency and determination, responded with renewed support. Donations, volunteer efforts, and messages of encouragement flowed in. In the months that followed, the current project not only stabilized but thrived, introducing new features that enhanced security and user experience. Frank saw the storm's aftermath not as damage but as a foundation for stronger growth. Standing once more on Cedarville's hilltop, Frank watched as homes lit up with clean, reliable energy. The breakthrough battery technology had survived the storm, and so had they. The experience had deepened his understanding that true innovation required courage not just to create but to endure. As the wind carried away the last of the storm clouds, Frank felt a profound gratitude. For the community that stood by him, the team that refused to quit, and the journey that had transformed doubt into strength. The storm had tested them, but it had also revealed the unbreakable current flowing through Cedarville, a current of hope, resilience, and unwavering belief in a better future. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?